Okay, part two. Welcome back. Recommendations for using essays. First one, like I said, only use essays for learning outcomes that really can't be easily addressed by other means. Now, why? Because it's a waste of everybody's time, right? So make sure that you reserve this just for those higher level thinking skills where you really need to see how information is organized in students' brains. Number two, construct questions that will target skills mentioned in teaching standards, which represent the big ideas and why you're teaching all this stuff in the first place. Some examples of social studies for behavioral science, right? Examine individual cognition, perception, behavior, and identity. Investigate interactions between individuals and groups. Assess the role that human behavior and culture plays in the development of social endeavors. Examine the progression of specific forms of technology and their influence within various societies. Right? These are all things that can be applied to the Spanish colonization unit that we looked at. Right? The idea of identity. Who did the Spanish people think they were? Why did they think they have the right? Why do you think that they thought their religion should be kind of imposed upon everybody else, and so on? When we think of interactions between individuals and groups, you have Doña Marina, you have Cortez, you have Atahualpa, you have Montezuma, right? Different leaders in different groups who also have different groups in the social classes in Spanish colonies of the four different levels of Spanish society, where they were each afforded different rights and therefore had different opportunities and suffered different fates and so on. We could do the same thing for political science, right? And we can go through these, but I think that you get the ideas. Ideally, I would have you go ahead and do some small group work right now, but we will have to save that for the assignment. Other recommendations. When you're making the question, make sure that you phrase the question so the task that you want them to perform is clearly indicated, right? A poor example, why do birds migrate? A better would be state 3 hypotheses that might explain why birds migrate in the fall, indicate which is the most likely to be true, and give reasons for your selection, right? This can easily be answered, to go to warmer places so they have more food and better shelter, right? That can be answered in a sentence. This is requiring students to cover each of the different hypotheses that you might have explored in class and then justify which is the best or likely to be most accurate. A much more complicated task. Another one, indicate an approximate time limit for each question or a page recommendation. In other words, tell them how extensive you want this response to be. You should also avoid the use of optional questions unless you're very careful. And I'm sure that many of you have had situations where the teacher or professor said, you can pick one of these 4 questions to answer. Or they said, here are 3 to prepare for. One of these will be on the test. Now, the thing that students like about that is that you get to pick one, and it limits the amount that you have to study. You also can pick the one you know the best to answer, right? Now, if the assessment is aligned with different objectives, and the essay only represents one of those objectives, well, now I don't get any information on all the other stuff. So by allowing you to only pick one because of time, I am basically shooting myself in the foot and not getting the total coverage that I should be getting. I'm also giving the students an easy out. I'm also getting a biased score because they're going to pick the one that they know the best rather than all the other ones. Now, the way around this is if each one of the questions measures the exact same objective. And say that I'm using an essay for my lesson objective for Spanish colonization, where I want them to be able to describe how the economic forces in Europe caused Cortez and Pizarro to go forth and conquer the Incans and what resulted of that. Suppose that's the case. Now I could ask questions about that in different ways that focus on the technology, the pressures in Europe, the resources of the Aztecs, the trade routes that were established. I could ask a bunch of different questions, but they're all getting at that general skill or that general amount of knowledge. I could also design the rest of my assessment to cover all the other learning objectives that I need covered. And so I can construct it in a way that I do give students the option. I just have to make sure that each one of my questions is assessing the same learning goal. Otherwise, I have coverage problems. Popham also says, think of what a good answer would look like. That is also very true. You should also incorporate all those other Popham rules within the recommendations that you are thinking about when using an essay. All right, so that brings us to scoring essays. And we're going to be talking about the differences between analytic and holistic rubrics. And really, we want to note that they're on opposite ends of a continuum rather than just being completely different types of things. They're not apples and oranges. They're all rubrics. They just have more or less structure. Now, an analytic rubric means that I have a lot of different categories. I've taken my goals apart and I've aligned them, and I've decided what different levels really look like. And this is the hardest part of it, really, where you have to think about what does it mean to be accomplished, competent, developing, or beginning. All right, so this is a very general, we call this a hyper-general, actually, rubric about writing. And here is another analytic rubric that is used in the Praxis 2. And there's 7 points, or 7-point range, 0 to 6, understanding the concepts and so on. When we think about this type of grid, I'm basically taking my major objectives or my major skills and then coming up with a grid of different descriptions that separate them out and let me score each skill separately and independently. Now, when you are trying to make a rubric, this is exactly what you're doing, regardless if you're going to use a holistic or an analytic. You have to describe what the skills are and what competence looks like. So when you have a good set of goals, and we're just starting to work on goals really now, right? I have a lesson goal, and then that lesson goal breaks down into sub-goals. And my sub-goals, when I put them together, should give me the lesson goal in a sense, but the lesson goal usually describes some additional integration of ideas. Not always in some content areas or for some lessons, but in general, that's how you should be thinking about it. That the lesson goal is not just the sum of the parts of the sub-goals, but it requires the integration of the sub-goals. In areas like math, the sub-goals tend to build on each other and kind of lead you to the lesson goal, but we'll talk about that later on. Now, if I have this goal structure, what I really want to do then is just turn that into my rubric, right? So my goal, and I have my lesson and sub-goals, and then I have my descriptions of what it means for a student to hit that goal. So for sub-goal 1, students will describe the 4 levels of Spanish society. So if I want a student to do that well, students need to describe each level. Very straightforward, super easy. That's what they need to do in order to demonstrate that skill. Sub-goal 2, students will describe the conditions of the lower classes. Well, so then I want them to make sure that they can talk about the Creoles and the natives and the rights they had under Spanish colonial law, right? Those would be some basic descriptions. And then sub-goal 3, how the economy of New Spain led to slavery. Crops and plantations make slavery kind of an attractive option for people who don't care about human rights and really want to create a lot of wealth for themselves. Now, put together, all 3 of these things individually can be met, but if you can't tie them together, you don't really meet the lesson goal. The goal of the lesson is to give you this basic information and then to see the relationships that exist within them. So the lesson goal then, if you succeed at meeting it, you will be able to, as a student, describe and integrate each of the 3 sub-goals, describing how the structure of New Spain promoted the poor treatment of lower classes and led to established practices of slavery. Again, trying to find those cause and effect relationships that exist within these different areas. If I'm going to then put this into a rubric format, we're going to use the 4-3-2-1 model, where 4 means that a student exceeds the standards, a 3 means that they meet the standards, a 2 is that they partially meet the standards, and a 1 means that they do not meet the standard. You could have a 0 option too. There's no evidence of anything, kind of thing. We're not going to worry about that. When I decide what the standard for success is, what a student has to do, that is my level 3, right? That's meeting the standard. If I want them to exceed that, I need to build in some options that allow them to do that. So in other words, I might have them also, as an add-on, describe how this practice was reflected in other types of colonies, how maybe the religion of the religious nature of Spain played a role in this, and how the beliefs that were inherent in Catholicism for Spain led people to see, heathens as less than human and needing saving and all that sort of stuff. So I could do that. Here, for the 4 levels and the rights afforded to each, they could go into more detail, or they could integrate this with other lessons, or they could come up with examples from the text where this wasn't followed. In other words, people who were born in the New World could own land or something like that. When we talk about this goal, we could do the same thing. This goal, we could do the same thing. I could keep going with examples, but I think you get the idea. The next thing I have to decide is, what does it look like if you can't quite do this, but you get some of it? So, the idea here, well, actually we'll go here because it'll be easier to talk about. So say a student doesn't get all 4 levels. Say they only get 3 out of the 4. Does that put them here? Or maybe they get the 4 levels, but the descriptions aren't quite right, or they mix up 2, right? Where do you draw the line? Do they have to describe all 4 levels? Or do they just have to get 3 of the 4 levels, right? In other words, right, if this was put in the form of a multiple choice test, you kind of have to get 100 in order to get into this meeting the standard category. So you have to decide, well, is it 100% and then 2 or 3, or I should say getting 2 or 3 correct puts you in partially, getting only 1 correct puts you in does not meet the standard, and so on, right? So you have to start to draw some lines in the sand about what constitutes standard performance, what constitutes partially meeting that standard, and what does it mean to not meet that standard clearly and concisely. Another example might be the science, right? I have my lesson goal. Students will describe how interactions in ecosystems lead to interdependency. That might be my goal for that lesson. Lesson 1 goal, I want them to identify and describe different symbiotic relationships. 2, I want them to identify and describe competitive and non-competitive predator-prey relationships. And then 3, describe how adaptations help organisms compete in an ecosystem, right? So again, my sub-goals can be measured independently. The lesson goal requires students to integrate those things. Putting that in this form of rubric again, those standards become my level 3. If I want to extend this, right, for symbiosis, I can think of other, depending on who you look at, there are either 4 to 6 different types of symbiotic relationships. Some people think predator-prey relationship is a form of symbiosis. I get conflicting reports on that, but well, we'll see. You can do what you want. You have to make that decision. Likewise here, predator-prey relationships, you can think of other similar, like scavenger type relationships that might be similar but not quite the same thing. You could come up with predatory plants. I don't know, something that extends this skill and deepens the knowledge. Likewise, going the other way, you have to think again about, well, if they can't do all 3, what counts as partial credit? What puts them in a 2? You almost got it, but not quite there. And what puts them in a 1? You don't got it, right? Again, partially meets a standard. Maybe you can describe 2 out of the 3 does not meet. You only get 1 or none of the 3 correct, or you can't do something important with it. So this is what an analytic rubric is. And they can get pretty big, they can get pretty complicated, but as long as you align them with the goals, they could actually be used for any kind of paper pencil test you give, not just an essay, right? You will have evidence that they can meet subgoal 1, evidence for subgoal 2, evidence for subgoal 3, and evidence for integrating all that to meet the lesson goal. And based on, if you don't like percentages, you can grade your paper pencil multiple choice matching tests in this same way using this same kind of rubric, right? Because it's aligned with the goals, it should give you the same results. Shouldn't matter. When we think of holistic rubrics, we are talking about a single score for overall cohesiveness. So if I'm going to use a 5-point setting instead of the 4, right? A 5 means that everything was great. 4 means that some of the things might have needed some work. 3, there are bigger issues and so on. Now, what I'm really doing is collapsing all these different goals into a single rating. So I might say that a high grade, the highest grade, might be that students describe in detail how different types of symbiotic and predator-prey relationships create an interdependency within, and how those relationships are shaped by the adaptations and the competition that exists within an ecosystem. That might be my level 5. Level 4 might be, there are some misconceptions or some minor misconceptions or maybe a lack of detail. 3, you have slightly larger problems. When we get down to a 1, right, it would be that you don't demonstrate understanding of most things, if anything at all. Now, the nice thing about this, when we apply this, right, we might think that I'm going to have a harder time with the holistic version. The analytic is so clear. The thing about the holistic is that you can be more flexible in how you can consider different strengths and weaknesses that students have. In other words, students might be kind of poor, say in subgoal 3, but maybe they're truly outstanding in these other areas. And you really want to give them credit, and you think that they deserve an A or a 4, even though there were some holes or chinks in the armor. This allows you to do that. This allows you to make sure that you have all the proper considerations that you want. Now, it does open the door for bias. It does open the door for problems with inter and intra-rater reliability if I go with something like this. It's not that great for giving feedback, right? When I think about how I might use these rubrics, right, when I jump back to something like this, I can just circle each one of these things and hand them back to the students in regard to their paper rather than writing these same comments on everybody's paper, right? When I think about ultimately developing a rubric that I want to share with my students to give them guidance to know what they're supposed to do, but also if I'm going to use it for feedback, I think about what it looks like in each one of these levels for each skill. And when there are issues with that, I just have to point to these areas and maybe underline something rather than writing, a couple pages of stuff for each student. When we think of the holistic rubric, right, if I'm not giving back the rubric to the students and I'm just grading, holistic rubrics are way faster. They allow you to do a lot of weighing of things that allow you to break free of this kind of rigid system where I start counting points and defining things in a very limited way. They're more flexible, and I recommend using them if you are not going to be sharing stuff with your students. It just goes a lot faster. But you should still do it, and you still need to consider what success at every level looks like, whether it's that way or this way, right? Otherwise, you won't know what you're looking for. Grading will be a kind of a random exercise for you, and it'll take you a while to get there. Now, when we think of the different rubrics, aside from the and holistic versions, you have also hypergeneral and task-specific and skill-focused. Now, hypergeneral rubrics can be used with anything, and they are not very specific at all. They're general, hypergeneral. Task-specific get to the nitty-gritty details of the specific task that you are completing or having your students work on. The skill-focused is kind of in the middle. And the skill-focused is the one that we recommend you using, where it is simply aligned to your students' skills. And the task-specific, I might get into, make sure you use this kind of font, and you have these kind of margins, and punctuation is like this, and it's on this kind of paper, and in this kind of binder, and so on. I really don't care about those things unless it's a class on how to do that. If I'm just worried about your ideas, all that stuff doesn't matter. And I have a construct validity issue, right? Where I am not really assessing the skills, but I'm folding in a bunch of other stuff about how well can you follow detailed directions. That's not what I want to do. When I think about the hypergeneral side of things, that means I have a social studies rubric that I can use for any assignment, for any objective. And if that's the case, it doesn't really give me any information on whether or not you met the specific objective that I made the assignment for. So that's a problem too. It doesn't give me information about whether or not you met the specific skill, because it can apply to anything. If I keep it skill focused or at the level targeted at the skills themselves, much like we did in these cases here, right, where I take my goals and I just turn them into a rubric, that is how you make a skills-focused rubric. Then I don't have any problems. I get information that I want, information that I need, and I can make good decisions. Okay, finally, recommendations for scoring. When we think about recommendations, right, 1, prepare an outline of the intended answer in advance. Make a good rubric. Usually when I have students make assessments themselves and they put some essay questions in there, I ask them, well, what's a good answer for this? And the usual reply that students give me is, I don't know, I hadn't really thought about it. Now, that's what most people do when they write an essay question. You have a general idea, I should ask them about this, but you never really walk it through and think, well, what will it take to answer this correctly or answer this well? Right. So make sure that you identify what you're looking for, because you'll probably realize that your first draft of your essay question isn't very good to get you what you want. So make sure you make a good rubric, think about what needs to be said, and then make sure your question will get them to give you the evidence you need. Second recommendation, use the scoring rubric that is most appropriate, analytic versus holistic, right? Again, there are some pros. Analytic, it helps you get more detail. It's more strict. You have better inter and intra-rater reliability. You can share it with the students before and after the assignment is completed. Holistic is looser. It's more flexible. That allows you to consider some other factors you might not have thought of. And it's just faster. It might even get you closer to the truth in some cases, right? Kind of like the whole Susie Snowflake thing, because it lets you cut through what might be non or irrelevant skills. Finally, describe how to handle other factors like penmanship, spelling, grammar, mechanics, and so on. These may or may not be important depending on the content area. It might be very important, essential, in which case it should count a lot. In other content areas, it shouldn't really count much at all unless you are going to integrate writing across the curriculum. But if you are going to make this a significant part of your rubric in a non-writing class, you better be providing some support and instruction. Otherwise, you're testing students on skills that you are not teaching them. You are not helping them develop, right? And that would be like me throwing in a bunch of science questions, right, on these assessment tests. I like science. I could throw in questions about my personal life that you would have no way of knowing, right? And that's a whole different construct that I don't want to be measuring. Writing and spelling and grammar and organization and voice and all that stuff can be an irrelevant construct. So you have to make sure that you are weighing it accordingly. Other reasons you might keep it include, well, you want kids to think carefully, you want them to work on their spelling, well, then make it minimal and offer opportunities and support for them to correct their mistakes and improve their skills. Otherwise, you shouldn't really count it at all. Usually this is a really good discussion in class, and I'm missing not having that discussion this year. Maybe I'll make a discussion board for it. Additional recommendations for scoring. You can increase your reliability if you look at all questions regarding one single topic or item at a time and then go to the next question. So instead of going through student A's whole test, right, I look at question 1 for student A, student B, student C, and so on, and then I move on to question 2 for students A, B, and C. That way I will not have to keep reminding myself what my criteria are. I'll kind of get in the zone. I'll be more efficient. So I'll be less fatigued. Then I'll be more consistent. Number 5, be as objective as possible. Try to cover up your names, grade anonymously, stick to your rubrics, and monitor your motivation and preconceptions. You have to be careful about these. A lot of times, too, you'll run across ordering effects where, an average paper that follows a terrible paper will be graded higher than if that same paper followed an outstanding paper, because we kind of shift our frames of reference without wanting to, unconsciously, by comparing the current example to recent examples that we might have seen. Finally, when there's a lot at stake, have multiple raters so you can check to see if you are being fair and if everybody would see it the same way. Greater consensus among different raters ensure that the right decision is going to be made. So in closing, 5 take-home points for essays and rubrics. 1, use a skill-focused rubric to keep construct validity high. Keeps you aligned with your objectives. You don't have a whole bunch of irrelevant stuff like eye contact and so on in a presentation that's not about public speaking, which I see all the time, get in the way of really assessing the content that you care about. Number 2, analytic rubrics are great for feedback and to keep inter-rater, when shared with students, and intra-rater reliability high. 3, holistic rubrics are great to keep you consistent and a lot faster than analytic rubrics. It can also increase the validity of the grades. Number 4, determine your policies on mechanics in content-related areas where mechanics are not what you are trying to measure to keep your construct validity high. Again, don't let somebody's ability to ability to write clearly influence your assessment of whether or not they understand the concepts in social studies. Finally, because grading time is extensive, especially with extended essays, make sure that you reserve essays for when the quality of the information that is provided is very important, that you cannot get it any other way and you care a lot about it. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of students, more than likely. I don't know if you want to be reading, 150 essays every week. That might be a recipe for disaster for some of you. Maybe some of you would love it. I don't know. All right, so based on what we've covered here in these last 2 videos, I'd like you to take the quiz on Canvas about essays and rubrics from the video lecture. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email, and I hope you have a great day.